Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
The number one greeting in my faith is peace.
You're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change.
You're going to find something, not 100%, every community. Rather than tear each other down, why not build each other up?
Welcome to the first episode of the first season, The Wretched of the Earth, of the fourth podcast. My name is Ali Wazir.
My name is Ibrahim Ali.
My name is Talha Muhammad.
And we will be your hosts for this podcast. As this is the first episode, we want to talk about the structure for a minute. The first episode, we will be discussing our seasonal theme through the lens of current affairs.
Next week, in our second episode, we will discuss it through the lens of culture.
In the third episode, we're going to talk about it through the lens of wellness.
And finally, in the last episode of the season, we're going to have an interview with someone who we feel has a great grasp of our seasonal theme. And we're going to take a 2-week break before starting our next season, which will have a drastically different theme and will be analyzed through the same lenses as this season. So let's talk now about our first season. This season, as mentioned before, is called The Wretched of the Earth, which we shamelessly stole from the great revolutionary Frantz Fanon, who wrote a book with the same exact title. The Wretched of the Earth is Fanon's discussion of decolonization in Africa and especially Algeria, where he fought against French occupation and
Imperialism.
Fanon talks about the overall effect of colonialism on the psychology of women and men in organized countries. In this first season, we're going to discuss the colonized mentality of Muslims.
So Fanon spoke specifically in his books about the effect of colonialism on Algerians, which is a Muslim majority country, because they faced occupation from France. But pretty much all Muslim majority areas, with very few exceptions, were colonized in the last century. And this definitely had an impact on every single one of these nations.
Yeah, we see the effect of colonization in countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also in like the northern African regions like Morocco and Algeria, where we saw the French, where they invaded the parts of northern Africa, and where the British, they invaded India and Pakistan. And Frantz Fanon, in his book, goes on to say that the colonization of these countries has a great effect on the psyche of the citizens and the population of these people.
And I think this really taps into all areas of life, whether it be culturally, whether it be your government structure, whether it be how we do media in these countries as well. So we see this effect as being widespread and very deep-rooted in the society as a whole, and we would just love to address it today.
Yeah, so to add on to what you're saying, Ali, it also has an effect on on our religion and how we perceive our own religion. So the ideas that our colonizers had of our religion and the ideas that they had on religion as a whole, especially since all the colonizing countries came from Europe after the Renaissance, they all had various ideas on religion, whether it be through the works of Voltaire or other influential writers of that era. And so that kind of language seeped in when we discuss our own religion as well as other aspects of life, like you mentioned, our culture, our way of life, our interactions with others.
So there are multiple ways where the colonized mentality of the Muslims manifests itself, and we're going to take a look at it in 3 different areas today. So the first, we're going to analyze the OIC and how it's not that useful for Muslims around the world. And then the second point that we're going to discuss is brain drain and how
how the brain drain is occurring, and how minds from well-established minds and extremely intelligent individuals are migrating from their countries of origin to Western countries, and therefore depleting their original nation or country of resources and mental equity is what I would call it.
And then the last topic that we're going to be looking at are protests and protesting. And specifically, we're going to look at the Arab Spring and how the colonizers basically set up the seeds for all this protest and strife that's going on in the Middle East right now.
Also, we might touch up on the topic of are protests really, the best way to go in regards to reestablishing a new government in these countries, and how we go about doing that in today's world.
So let's start off talking about the OIC. The OIC stands for the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It was established in 1969 as a sort of European Union kind of establishment, but for Muslim countries specifically. It's got 57 member states from around the globe, and the stated objective is for these countries to be able to work together to
kind of solve the current problems happening in the Muslim world.
We have a lot of problems, right?
So the OIC is led mostly by countries that are under extreme economic influence from countries in the West. Actually, we can see the effect of foreign influence in most of these countries. So what ends up happening is that this organization is pretty incompetent on a global stage. We can talk about how there's a lot of Muslim minorities in various countries around the world right now that are undergoing extreme oppression, whether it be the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Burma. We can talk about even Yemeni Muslims and the strife that they're facing today. But the OIC hasn't really stepped in and solved any issues in these countries, nor do they seem likely to ever do that. It also a big part of why the OIC is as incompetent as it is because there's great division within Islamic countries.
So would you say that the division is caused by the colonized mentality, so to say, or like the seeds that were sowed by the colonizers that came before these governments existed?
Yeah, big time, man. You can definitely see the effects that the effects of our colonizers on our unity. So whether that be in like as simple things as like dividing the Arab Muslims by language, so Arabs often divide themselves nowadays on whether to speak French as a second language or whether to speak English as a second language, and that's based on whether the French occupied their countries or whether the English occupied their countries. And then you also have different political alliances that were established during this era but have just kind of worsened as time has gone by. So a good example of why the OIC doesn't work is because it includes countries that are very much at odds with each other right now. Like Saudi Arabia and Iran are both part of the OIC, but these two countries very rarely agree to meet each other on a world stage and talk to each other about how they can benefit the greater Islamic community, the Islamic global community.
I think to a certain degree, it also has to do with almost like a selfish attitude, where every country is essentially looking to their own economic benefit versus helping the ummah or the nation at large of Muslims. So you have countries that refuse to, for example, being a Pakistani, the prime example for me is Imran Khan's lack of desire to assist the Uyghur Muslims, but rather he turns a blind eye simply due to China's economic favoring towards Pakistan.
So I think a main reason about why this is that when these colonizers came, they kind of suppressed us for so long that we weren't able to establish our economies and establish our ourselves. And when during the British rule of India, from the 1700s to the early 1900s. The first half of the 1900s, when the British occupation first ended, the per capita GDP of the Indian population did not go up at all. So this is the sort of stall to progress that the colonizers basically made these countries go through. So this is why, and they also came through, like, for example, in North Africa, right? They came through and they drew up these imaginary lines and made up these imaginary borders and kind of divided us, the old divide and conquer strategy.
So to go off of that economy kind of thing, it also shows how to this day there's a lot of like economic imperialism, quote unquote, so to say. You can see this in a simple fact, like Africa, the entire continent of Africa, has a big trade deficit with the rest of the developed world, in that the amount of money that goes from the developed world to Africa is far less than the amount of resources that come out from Africa and benefit the Western world. And Africa, is a continent with the second most number of Muslims after Asia, and it also has a great number of OIC countries, right? But while they keep this trade deficit where, the Western world only puts so much money into Africa, it only invests so much money into Africa, while at the same time stripping Africa of much of its resources, whether that be lithium in the Congo or, all the very rare, very important natural resources that the continent of Africa, including the Muslim majority parts of Africa, has, then this kind of economic colonialism continues,
Talha, I think you make a great point, man. Also, it really has to do with going back to World War I, for example, with the Ottoman Empire, and how the Ottoman Empire was essentially collapsed upon itself, really, in regards to Muslims being offered land and nation and statehood just to simply assist the British in that war. Or if one were to simply study the historical facts behind the breakdown of that empire entirely, and how it was essentially split apart into different nations, and how nationalism grew, that really is just a foundation from, or that set of foundation directly from the colonized mindset.
So
how they were offered land or offered statehood for their quote unquote people, which allowed for this separation of nationhood and a whole complete separation of identity from amongst Muslims specifically. Now we see in the 21st century where many Muslims will identify with their country before they identify as Muslim.
Yeah.
Being from my parents being from Pakistan, you hear them say, "Yeah, I'm Pakistani," before they admit to being Muslim, which is really odd. And
so would you say that this intense nationalism that we have, or this intense pride for our country, how would this relate to colonialism, right? The colonized mentality that we've had. How would you say it relates to Ali?
I think that's a good question. I think it has to do with just a desire for people of a similar culture and similar identity to have their own nationhood and to have their own statehood. And once that is developed, you get national anthems, you get flags, you get Dil Dil Pakistan, and all these all these songs.
That was a good song, man.
all these things to kind of hype up your identity as a Pakistani before you can even study who the Prophet ﷺ was, who how deep rooted the lack of racism is in Islam. So you start dealing with people of your own like-mindedness, and you create this closed circle, and it is reinforced by having the same language, having the same foods, having the same clothes, and being able to say, "Yeah, I'm Pakistani," and going from there.
Yeah, but to go off of that, like this entire kind of disease of nationalism across the world, but especially in Muslim communities, unfortunately, this is an exact kind of this ties in exactly to what we're talking about. So when we say that when we talk about nationalism, that's an idea that was invented by mostly European thinkers of the post-Renaissance era, and they exported that onto us when they came around and colonized us. Somebody living in the Ottoman Empire or in the Mughal Empire, like maybe 400 or 500 years ago, as our ancestors probably were, they would be there wasn't really an idea of a nation state then as there is today, right? Yeah. They would primarily identify with their religion or their city or some ideas that they had, rather than just an arbitrary geographical location with randomly drawn borders, right? And the thing is, like, a lot of these borders don't even make sense, because if you're talking about, like, you and I are both we both have heritage from Pakistan.
Yes,
Pakistan is not to rip on it too much, but it is like a made-up country, right? There's no unifying language amongst the people. Everybody speaks a different language. That's why a lot of them were forced to learn Urdu.
Aren't all countries made up though?
Every country is made up, and you're right about that, right? So that's the thing. Like, this is a European ideal that was kind of
pushed onto the world.
Pushed
at
onto
large.
the world,
Mhm.
and really the fact that it still sits within us shows that we still have a colonial mentality.
Yeah.
Right? We still have the mentality of a colonized people that we submitted to the ideas of our colonizing overlords,
Yeah.
right? So this really hinders like the progress of the OIC. If this nationalism has sunk so deep into us, then when a Pakistani or when the Pakistani government, you know, I'm going off of what you brought up, you know, when they are looking at how Uyghurs are being treated in China, you know, it's a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, they're not our citizens of our country,
Yeah.
right? What does that even mean? What does it mean to be from Pakistan?
Yeah.
It's so arbitrary, right?
That's true.
And that's why the OIC is rendered as useless as it is, right? In theory, this was a great idea. You know, like 50 years ago, when the great thinkers of the last century were coming up with this idea, they thought it would help reunite the Muslim communities. But before making something like this, we have to get rid of the colonial mentality from our own communities.
So
right?
what do you think, what's a good way to, you know, what's like a good first step, or like what's a good starting place to, you know, just start to get rid of that mentality so we can, you know, come together as an ummah?
Well, I think it really starts at home. To be honest with you, I think parents have to be willing to have their children identify as Muslims before anything, and I would hope that within our generation, at least, you know, being the youth, being able to give back to, you know, our future children, inshallah, we'll be able to develop a love for the religion and a love for people of the religion, and also other people when we call to the deen as well.
I think you mentioned a really important point there is that people of the religion. I think what's happening is that there's, especially like overseas, there's like a distrust of religious leadership. So, and I think that translates over here too, where there's not a distrust, but maybe a disrespect, or a they don't, you know, take these religious leaders seriously.
I think that's very true, especially when you look at the Iranian Revolution. A lot of individuals, they simply left Iran because of the revolution and because they felt as though the religious laws imposed upon them were too strict. Whether or not they were actually legitimate religious laws is a whole different discussion. But as you can see now, a lot of Persians, a lot of Iranians, even a lot of Kurds, they, you know, their children are suffering from a religious point of view. And that I know many personal friends that, you know, they come from these places and they have absolutely left, you know, not you know, they still call themselves Muslim, but their attachment and their iman level is not at a place where we would like to see that specifically.
Muslims in name only, right?
Exactly.
So let's switch up gears for a second. Let's go back to the economic points of view that we were talking about and how brain drain is such a big problem.
Yes, sir.
Right? So even after our colonizing overlords, to go back to that, even after they left, right?
Yeah.
They left in our countries in such a way and had colonized our mentalities in that, you know, a big part of many Muslim majority third world countries is to get out of there, making it big. Like a point of pride for my grandfather is that all three of his kids eventually immigrated to the United States.
Yeah.
Right. And what this does is that this really dampens like the economic status of our home countries, of our home like Muslim majority countries, and it impedes economic progress in there. So
yeah, that's very true. I think brain drain is a major issue happening specifically from Asian and Middle Eastern countries. You see a lot of individuals, they're given opportunities. They go through middle school and high school, and resources are poured into them for their academic success. And yet they take, after getting the degree, they realize, hey, I have a $100,000, $500,000 job in the States, possibly, and they decide to jump ship and essentially leave the country, and with minimal plans on returning for long term. I mean, we see even amongst ourselves that we go to Pakistan. I haven't been to Pakistan in 12 years. I know people that go, every 1 or 2 years, but it's just for a visit. You're not necessarily giving back to the community. You're not trying to develop the country. You might be giving your zakat, and I know a lot of people say, "Hey, we give our zakat in Pakistan," but your 2%, how much good is it actually going to do versus you being there and providing mental and emotional assistance to the individuals around you, and being able to see the issues that are actually being faced in that local community, being able to target them one at a time.
So maybe the start of this would be when like let's give an example, because my parents are from India, right? So I think I have my frame of reference is from there, and you guys are from like Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
So when the British people, when they colonized us, what happens is that the classes were made. There was this working class. The caste system that was already in place was it was accentuated, and it was amplified. So, like it or not, right, the people who made it to this country were from the upper classes of society.
Yeah,
they were not there. If you go back to India right now, the poorest people over there are still suffering. Like they don't have jobs.
Yeah.
They're being persecuted, especially in India. They're being persecuted. Just to bring it back to the point of colonization, right? The colonized mentality. So maybe when colonizers came and they divided us up into these classes, of people. It was in effect, while they were draining our resources, our natural resources, they divided us up, and they set us up for failure by making sure that only a select few people, leave the country. Yeah. And we don't contribite back to the economy.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tal.
All right. You brought up a great point, which is that if you look at some minority communities here in the United States, Pakistani Americans, for example, are considered a model minority. Crime rates within our demographic here are, much lower than, basically any other ethnicity.
But that would be
essentially
in the United States, right?
In the United States, that's my exact point,
Yeah.
right? And we have some of the highest levels of education and so on. But this is just representative of Pakistanis in the United States, right? And it's because only the best Pakistanis, who are the most educated, right, the most potential in them, are allowed to come here. So in that essence, what happens is that the top, like the cream of the crop, is
The top 1%.
that top 1% is exported from Pakistan to over here. So whenever people get that education, they have that promise to give to a community, they instead come and give it to another community over here. So going with your point, Adi.
So I believe the brain drain really plays a massive role in how society shapes our children, especially because when our parents left Pakistan and India with no legitimate plans on returning, now future generations and future progeny get affected by the societies and morals of this nation. And the societies and morals of America are constantly changing. I don't know if you guys remember, but just 10 years ago, I'm going to be real, if you called a person gay at school, it was a derogatory comment. And the guy or girl would say, hey, I'm not gay. They would legitimately get triggered because you called them gay. And, within, 5 years, we see that gay marriage is legalized, and gay marriage is now the norm in society. It's one of the norms. And also, for example, marijuana. We see marijuana was a taboo topic within the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And now we've got legalization of marijuana, recreational marijuana in many countries. And I think especially with young kids coming from immigrant backgrounds, you see such a drastic change in their perspective that it really confuses them. And it's not just the brain drain that's affecting the parents, but it's also affecting the children and future progeny as well. Because how do you know what are your morals and values if they're constantly shifting in a society? So yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Abby?
So I mean, when you mentioned marijuana, right? I think that it's not really connected to brain drain, but I found an interesting connection that it is connected to colonialism and the colonized mentality of not just Muslims, but minorities in general. Why do you think marijuana is illegal? I mean,
I think this is a really big tangent, man.
This is a big tangent because it goes back to the war on drugs during the Reagan era.
I think marijuana is classified as a level 1 drug because of the harmful effects of hallucinogens, and we as Americans must protect our children from.
This is the clip they come back to before they cancel us.
Thank you for that interjection. All right, so let's talk about another thing, right? Like, why did our parents or grandparents choose to come to this country in the first place? Is because taking it back to colonized mentality, for some reason we value our own educational institutions at a much lower level than foreign or Western institutions, right?
Man, I don't know, man. You get that rich though from NED. That's pretty. That's pretty. That's high key, pretty hardcore right there, man. Mashallah. My bad, but yeah, go ahead.
It's all good, man. NED is where it's at, man. But yeah, I mean, even though we have like, old institutions within our own countries, and ones that have produced like some of the great scholars of the world, unfortunately, due to our colonized mentality, we'll still value Ivy League, as like so high. We'll still say Cambridge and Oxford as though those things are like some crazy level that we've made it if we go over there.
Yeah, that's
right?
very true.
And so what do you have to say to that, Ibrahim?
I mean,
how do you think the colonized mentality affects our perception of the Western world and why we see it as so much
the entire
greater?
reason why we think it's greater, right? Because let's say, for example, right, India, right, is colonized by the British people, and like the people who, the generation that migrated to, for example, our parents' generation, right? So our parents didn't necessarily, the generation of our parents, they didn't necessarily live under British occupation, right?
Yeah.
But their parents did.
Yeah.
And so they have this like view of like the British colonization where they think that they're the British or like the whites, right? They think that they're a superior race or a superior society.
Yeah.
So they think that when they've moved from their country of origin to like a white centric or like a white superior country like America or Britain or Australia or New Zealand or any of these countries, right? When they think that they've made it there because when they were colonized, that thought was put into their head, that seed was planted, that you are inferior and the white colonizer is superior to you.
You know what's interesting from a more from a religious perspective is the opinion of Maulana Maududi. I don't know if you guys recognize the name. He's a very great scholar from the subcontinent. And you guys recognize the name?
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Mashallah. All right. No comment. So Maulana Maududi had a really great insight in regards to the social happenings of what was going on in India, what is modern day India, Pakistan. And he recognized that when the British came originally, they were actually taking individuals that were of greater intellect and greater knowledge and moving them over to secular education versus, and then they would actually send over individuals with lesser intellect and lesser education over to the religious studies, which is interesting because from right there and then you see this divergence of the standards of secular education versus Islamic or religious education. And even in today's society, when you hear of a child or whether it be a young boy or girl going into religious studies full time, for whatever reason, our parents don't necessarily see that individual as being of the same status as a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. I personally think it's, just being real, I think it's whack.
Oh man, big time.
Especially like back home, right?
Yeah.
You always send like the least smart or the kid with the least potential will always like go to
madrasa, right?
Yeah, low key, it's true.
Like a dud kid.
and I spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and that's exactly what happens. Like the stupid kid, right? Yeah. Say like you have like 5 kids in the family, like the dumb one, that's the one that you sent to madrasa to get an Islamic education. Which brings me to 2 points, right? Like it's very interesting, first of all, how the colonizers enforced their own views on, religious education and secular education and the division between those two onto us. So classically, when you see our own polymaths, right, people like Ibn Sina, whatever you think of his religious views, but, right, and other people like Ar-Razi and stuff, there were great Muslim scientists who also delved a lot into theology, whether you agree with their theology or not. That's something that was always there on their mind. So when they'd be talking about medicine or, astronomy, mathematics, they would also be thinking about, the nature of God. And it was all super interconnected within Islamic institutions and Islamic education systems, right? But when the Europeans came, for them, they're polymaths like Da Vinci. Da Vinci never thought about religion too much. Okay, maybe he was like, was Da Vinci or Michelangelo employed by the church? I don't really know.
I think Michelangelo.
Oh, Michelangelo.
Yeah, he did statues
Okay,
for the church,
Michelangelo. I don't know.
That's a good question.
But it's not like they wrote treatises on their religion. For them, they believed strongly in a division of
Church and state.
Church and state because it went so poorly for them, right? But that's not necessarily how it worked in the rest of the world. So that's part A of the colonial mentality, where we can't fuse madrasas and schools, right? They should be, right? Our religion delves into secular topics as well. The longest verse in the Quran is about contracts, right? Between people. That's finance over there. Like, and then the other point that I was thinking about is how we perceive Islamic education, which I guess you guys already hit upon. But why is a madrasa lower than
why don't we consider, for example, Al-Azhar, to be of greater educational value than Harvard?
See, I don't know if you guys noticed this, but I feel like there's a positive shift in the dynamic over here in this country, where like if you're a Hafiz, right, there's generally a little bit more respect for you or for what you've done or accomplished than back home.
So I think there's like respect for Hufaz anywhere, right, in the world. Alhamdulillah, at least that's still there, whether you're in the Arab world or back on the subcontinent. If you're a Hafiz, people are generally proud of you. Your parents will say that proudly, but it's what are we expecting from our Hufaz, right? So what ends up happening in back home and here as well, actually, is that being a Hafiz limits you to giving Friday khutbahs when you grow up a bit more, and before you grow up leading Taraweeh prayer. They're not seen as community leaders or anything, right? Again, there's no empowerment of the Hufaz because that's still considered less. Whereas somebody who goes and becomes a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, that guy's ready to manage things, right? Get on the board, right?
Somehow he can get on the board of the masjid, and somehow he can give back to the community at a greater level than your Hufaz. Yeah.
I mean, again, another point is that does being a Hafiz necessarily qualify you for a position of leadership? And I personally don't think so. I think that I meant to expand on my point a little bit by saying that by becoming a student of knowledge and learning the classical Islamic sciences, and I think that has that's gained a little bit more respect over the years, especially in this country.
Yeah, amongst our generation specifically.
But again, I mean, we're trying to talk about bigger topics over here, I feel, and the sample of Muslims in this country is 0% of the world the global Muslim population.
So that's very true. Going back to the brain drain though, you see that these morals and norms are definitely being affected, and now we have to openly discuss
how exactly we wanna switch that up, right? What's the best way to voice this to our governments and to the people in power, right? Now, what we often end up going to is protests. Right?
Yes, definitely. So I think if we're gonna analyze protests, right? One major protest or a movement of protests was the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, starting in Tunisia, right?
Yeah, that started in Tunisia. December 2010. Yeah.
So
SubhanAllah, man,
it's been a long time. So I mean, usually, or when it first started off, the Arab Spring was thought of as the fourth wave of democratization, or so basically.
I don't know what the first three waves were, but I take your word for it. Continue.
So meaning that how these countries have these entire spiels on how democracy is the greatest, right? And I think that's another side effect of the colonial mentality where they think that democracy is the only way to run things, and the United States government is let's support any country in its effort for democracy.
And they have a very specific view of democracy as well.
Look at anywhere, like Venezuela, for example. Very recently, they had somebody who tried to overthrow their government in a U.S. supported coup, just because they were trying to set up a democratically elected government. So that's just another a side effect of the colonized like the colonialization of these countries, where even if you look at the Arab Spring, a lot of these protests and these uprisings were U.S. backed, especially in Libya.
Yeah.
And we all know how that ended out, right? You know how that ended up. If anybody doesn't know, the vacuum that was left by the uprising in Libya basically started basically planted the seed for ISIS.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
So, you have anything to add to that?
I think from a specific perspective, we have to look at how do Muslims go about protesting? Does a protest necessarily have to become violent? Do we have to do it in a specific manner? Is there a fiqh to protesting? Is there a specific way?
I'd be careful with that. I don't think any of us here are qualified to give fatwa on.
By all means, I'm not asking for a fatwa or anything, but like that. But I'm asking, are the protests that are occurring right now in today's society really effective? Because look, for example, you have Syria, which is still undergoing political turmoil. Right, you have Egypt, which is undergoing political turmoil,
or is in a state of dictatorship.
Yeah, as of right now, yeah, and you have many countries that have attempted to overthrow their government, whether it be peacefully or non-peacefully, and we don't see the results ending up as expected by any means. You get civilizations, infrastructure destroyed, you get history wiped off the map, and I think it's really interesting how, to a certain degree, we're still pushing for revolutions or democratic revolutions to a certain degree, but we're not seeing the end result at all.
So, I mean, there's an argument that can be had over there is this push for democratization, is that the best way to go around things, right? So I think that this a side effect of the colonial mentality is that we think that this U.S. view of democracy is the best way to run governments, and the U.S. goes and interferes in these governments and messes things up. And trying to bring it back to our main overarching theme is the book that was written by Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. He used psychiatry to analyze how the French colonization and the carnage of the Algerian War in North Africa affected the psyche of the Algerians.
Well, I think you make a great point. What Fanon is referring to here is how the French essentially mentally destroyed the Algerian people to the point where they were okay accepting the values and norms and government structure of the French people. And you see that all across the world, and I think you see that especially with Western countries and how they portray how successful they are. Even though we here in America have our own issues, student debt and so on and so forth, and racism and whatnot. But we portray an image of immaculate success that individuals from all over the world see this image or this portrayal of American values and say, hey, maybe if we do it that way, we'll also be successful. We'll also achieve, immaculate success at that level. And they don't realize it's essentially a facade to a certain degree, simply because not everything is, rainbows and butterflies over here.
You're right.
You know what I'm saying?
And again, that's like a side effect of the imperialistic colonial mentality that the American, their foreign policy encourages.
Yeah. It is kind of going off on a tangent, but it's also it has to do with Western propaganda, right? So people living abroad think in the U.S. the streets are paved with gold, how do we get to that? How do we get to that level? And
in reality, in Western nations, we actually have a very poor public infrastructure.
We have some of the worst public infrastructure, especially in this country. And on top of that, the economic inequality in this country is off the rails.
It's crazy.
That's nothing that we want to emulate in our majority part of the world.
I think it also comes back to a certain degree to culture as well, how people view American culture, and also how you can define American culture too. And
how America exports its culture through Hollywood, right?
Exactly. And almost like the McDonaldization, is that what it's called, I believe, of society, where we take, KFCs and McDonald's and we ship them off to all across the world. Now you got McDonald's.
So I think this is leading into our next episode of the podcast, which is culture, where we talk about
yeah, bro. So we'll hit him with a 2-1. You know, right now.
We're gonna wait for next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
ladies and gentlemen, we'll be seeing you next week. I hope you join us for another podcast on the Wretched of the Earth, Season 1, with the boys here on the 4th. And next week's topic will be hitting culture in regards to the colonial mindset. So I hope you folks will join us then. And as right now, I hope you have a great rest of your week.